chapter 6, verse 35. I'm going to start with a question. Are you wowed by Jesus while you are still at war with him? Are you wowed by Jesus while at war with him? Is he somebody who wows you rather than somebody you worship? Are you wowed by Jesus and yet you remain at war with him? To piggyback off of last week, we compared two kingdoms. We saw Herod's kingdom. We were in the royal palace. And right after Herod's kingdom, we saw Jesus' kingdom. He walks out into the wilderness, and he feeds the 5,000, which we're looking more closely at today. And perhaps a more practical way to ask it is, do you party more like Herod, or do you party more like Jesus? Whose party is your party? Whose party captures the affections of your heart? We see in Herod that he has the full storehouses. Those in his life, those at his birthday, are those whom he allows. He takes no personal responsibility for the subject of his kingdom. Rather, he keeps them at a distance. And next to Herod, we saw Jesus, with every right to remain on the throne in heaven, and yet instead he puts on human flesh. He becomes a servant, and he uses his strength to care for the wayward. He draws near to them. Question, do we party more like Herod, or do we party more like Jesus? Are you at war with Jesus, even while you remain wowed by him? Verse 36, the disciples command Jesus, I think it's a really interesting perspective, they command Jesus to send the crowd away so that they can buy food. And Jesus responds to them in verse 37, he says, you feed them. The disciples begin to quarrel with Jesus over the absurdity of such a suggestion. And if you notice down in verse 45, Jesus does send the crowd away. And in the ESV, it says dismiss, but it's actually the same verb. It's the same that the crowds, when the disciples said send them away, down in verse 45, it says Jesus did send them away. But Jesus sent the crowd away only after he fed them. And while Jesus' disciples were content to send this new Israel away starving, Jesus was not. And it's this second miracle, the one that comes after the feeding of the 5,000, that explains why Jesus and the disciples differed. If you look down at verse 51, it says, Jesus got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they, that is the disciples, were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. The water miracle, then, is linked to the bread miracle by the word loaves. Mark is putting these side by side, and he's providing commentary about the disciples through these two scenes. And so don't miss this. In verse 51, what does it say? They were amazed. They were utterly astounded. They were very impressed, shocked, wow. But if you keep on reading, you see they were still at war with him. Their hearts were hardened. You can be wowed by Jesus and at war with Jesus at the same time. Not everyone at war with Jesus speaks ill of him. The disciples were wowed while at war. If you want, flip over with me real quickly to Mark chapter 8, and you'll see this theme continue. Mark chapter 8, verse 17. It says, and Jesus, aware of this, said to them, this is the disciples, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? This is the language of idolatry. Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not understand? Jesus has just made bread for a crowd for a second time in Mark chapter 8, and all the disciples can do is fight about the fact that their bread's getting low. They still don't understand who Jesus is. They're still at war with what he is showing them, and they therefore, in our passage today, still party like Herod rather than like Jesus. And I noticed as I have become a Christian, when I became a Christian 15 or so years ago, I began to notice that in a lot of ways, myself and others, we still live amazed by Jesus, but can often live as if we are still at war with him. Whereas Jesus commands each and every one of us to become like him in our care and provision for others, we in the West, in our provision, often use money to outsource our obedience like Herod. God is with us, we love to say. But we don't actually want to take responsibility to greet the stranger. That's what those 5 minutes in the middle of service should be for. But my greeting time ends after the service ends. After that, I'm gone. I don't intend to actually obey and pursue one another. Parents, we love to say God is with us. And even though we don't read the Bible for ourselves, much less our family, we demand our youth activities, despite the fact that God has commanded fathers to raise their children in the knowledge and instruction of the Lord. The church does not exist to outsource your responsibility to lead your home in worship. Rather than taking our responsibility to speak the gospel with others, we say, hey, I'll serve in the background, but I'll never give Jesus to someone else through my words. Here's what I can do, but don't ever ask me to speak the good news to someone else. Instead of offering our bodies as living sacrifices, as an act of worship, we compartmentalize it to the music portion. We give most of our money and volunteer energy to putting on music for Sunday, rather than realizing that what a heart of worship is someone who lives their whole life to make disciples of Jesus. That's what worship is. We've got a church building. Why would I ever invite a brother or sister into my home? Isn't that why we have this space? But when Jesus tells his disciples to feed the crowd, what he was telling them is he was telling them, don't be like Herod. Don't be like Herod. And the disciples' response was, no, you feed them. We can't feed them. They didn't understand because they would rather party like Herod than like Jesus. They were wowed by Jesus, but they were still at war with him. And so I ask you this morning, are you still at war with Jesus? Are you simply amazed by him? You like to be amazed in his name. Play me a song that impresses me about Jesus, or do this or that in Jesus' name. Impress me. But when it comes time to following him in the day-to-day, to speaking the gospel, to greeting one another, to showing hospitality when it doesn't fit into your calendared events, does it demonstrate you are at war with Jesus still? We're going to fly over this passage twice real quickly. We're going to do two things. First, we're going to look at the obvious. Then we're going to look at the blindness. I think there's two things going on in this passage, in these two passages. There is obvious and there is blindness. Lauren has developed this statement. She lives in a house with 5 guys. There's me and our 4 boys, and so she gets what she calls, you looked like a man, didn't you? When we're looking for something, she said, you looked like a man looks, don't you? And what do? We go and we stand in front of the closet and it's not there, even though it's obviously there. But thankfully, Lauren is in our family, and she can always find everything. And what Mark wants you to do is he wants you to see what is so obvious about Jesus in these two passages. He's showing you something that is obvious so that you don't, like the disciples, look like a man, that you're not blind like they are. So let's look at what's obvious. If you'll remember, the scene at Herod's birthday opens over a debate over Jesus' identity. Who is this man? And you know that this will resolve itself in Mark chapter 8 towards the end. And when Peter finally confesses Jesus' true identity. But for now, Mark is going to, through these two miracles side by side, he's telling you who Jesus is. He wants to make it obvious through this healing miracle, through the bread miracle and the water miracle, that Jesus' identity is unmistakable, and the obviousness comes through nostalgia. Nostalgia. It comes through nostalgia. You're a faithful Israelite. You're reading this passage, and it's a lot like a Southerner going into Cracker Barrel. And all of that experience at Cracker Barrel, I remember growing up in a setting similar to this, with this warm Southern comfort food, the big fireplace. This reminds me of days gone by. It's great to experience again. What Mark is doing here is he's flavoring this whole scene so that the Israelite reading this is going, I've been here before. We've been here before, Israel. And so let's look at these two scenes real quickly. First, as we leave the shadow of Herod's place, where does Jesus lead his disciples? Where does Jesus lead his disciples as we walk away from Herod's? Verse 31, he calls them to a desolate place. You see it down again in verse 35. Jesus leads the disciples into a desolate place. And any Israelite reading this remembers, desolate place. Well, first of all, Adam, the earth has been cursed, work has been cursed, the ground is difficult in bearing fruit because of the curse. But most specifically, they remember the desolate place, the wilderness, because after they left the shadow of Pharaoh's palace and Egypt, they wandered into the wilderness for 40 years. The wilderness is a thematic reminder that what God once did, it seems he may be doing it again. When they hear wilderness, remember, we've been in a desolate place before in Exodus 13, verse 20. And Mark is setting out our expectation immediately. Jesus may be up to a second Exodus. Well, what's the concern out in a wilderness? Verse 44. Well, there's 5,000 men reported, which means there are 5,000 men plus more women and children. And what's the problem? Verse 36, there's not enough food to feed them. We've got to deal with the fact that there's a large crowd of Israelites and there's not any food, and we're out in the middle of a desolate place. Does this sound familiar? Listen to Numbers 11. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them and be enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them and be enough for them? And the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's hand shortened? Moses is looking around and going, God, how are you going to feed all these people in Numbers? So what does Jesus do in verse 40? Well, he organized them into groups of 100s and 50s. Well, wait a minute, Exodus 18:21, Moses did the same thing. He organized people into 1,000, into 100s, into 50s and 10s. And so an Israelite's watching is going, Jesus thinks he's Moses. What a silly guy. He thinks he's Moses. But then what happened? Verses 41 to 42. From Jesus' hand comes enough food to feed and satisfy the entire group. Sounds familiar. Exodus 13. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine, flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. You see, Jesus didn't look to the Lord to provide the bread. From Jesus' hands come the multiplication of the bread and the fish. Jesus is not only like Moses, he's better than Moses. Verse 46, what does he do? He then goes up on a mountain to meet with God the Father. Exodus 24, verse 13, Moses went up into the mountain of God. And so from this scene, Israel is to hear all of these reminders of what took place in Exodus and Numbers. This looks so familiar to all of us. There's two other parallels here. We saw in verse 34 last week, Jesus was the good shepherd that God was providing. And of course, that was Moses' concern. If Moses was going to die in the wilderness, God needed to provide another shepherd for his people. So God gave Israel Joshua to lead them into the promised land. So now here we have again Jesus, who is the good shepherd, to lead his people. But also, just as Israel in Exodus 14 left Egypt to cross the sea at night and through the early morning, we see here the same thing. The 12 apostles who have come to represent the new Israel is also crossing the sea in this second water miracle. But there's two particular details it's supposed to stand out most clearly to us. When the apostles are struggling to cross the sea, you look down at verse 48, Mark notes that Jesus does not deliberately go to them. It says he meant to pass them by, which is really strange. Why does it say that Jesus meant to pass them by? Was Jesus avoiding them? Maybe Jesus is an introvert. He's doing what many of us would have done. He said, I really don't want to talk with them. I'm going to go this way across the sea. Maybe he wanted to scare them. He was going to sneak up on them. That's not what he's doing, though. Mark is not saying Jesus was trying to avoid his disciples, but rather he's doing something else that screams, this is familiar. Listen to Exodus 33, verse 21. And the Lord said, behold, there's a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed. In the Greek translation of our Hebrew Old Testament, this is the same verb that Mark is using here. He uses another place in 1 Kings 19, verse 11. And he said, this is the Lord speaking to Elijah, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. You look down at our passage, verse 51. It says that after Jesus passed them by, he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. You see what Mark is saying? He's trying to say there's something really obvious going on. Jesus' identity is very clear. But if you're not clear on it yet, let's look at verse 49. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, or I am. Do not be afraid. Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And when you're at sea, I think it's a very presumptuous comfort to terrified people to walk by them and say, I am. You imagine this building is falling down or this burning down in flames, and I just say to you, Crossroads, it is I. You would be perfectly reasonable to still be terrified and to leave, because there's nothing I can do in that moment to save that building or keep it from falling down. Run away if this building is on fire. But Jesus approaches them and he says to them, I am, do not be afraid. Now, it's true, if you know your Old Testament, this is the same thing Yahweh says to Moses, right? He calls him from the burning, through the burning bush, and Moses says, well, who should I say sent me? And Yahweh says, I am. But there's another passage that I think Jesus is quoting. In Isaiah 41, this is the passage Pastor Nate read this morning, verse 10, you have near identical language where Yahweh, speaking of the second Exodus, says, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, I am your God. And just a few verses later in Isaiah 41, verse 18, Yahweh says, I will open rivers on the bare heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness, the desolate place, a pool of water, and the dry land springs of water. I will put in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle, and the olive. I'll set in the desert cypress, the plane, and the pine together, that they may see and know, may consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it. That is, Yahweh is promising Israel that there's going to be a great reversal. And that reversal is going to be signified by the fact that a desolate place becomes a place of abundance. That's the point. And what Isaiah is saying is that to demonstrate that Yahweh is in fact going to deliver Israel, the signs of the second Exodus is that a place of a complete barrenness would become a place of total fruitfulness. See that? Isaiah is telling them the mark of the second Exodus is that a sign of barrenness, a place of barrenness, will become a place of fruitfulness. And so what does Mark capture down in verse 42? Out in the wilderness, this massive crowd where there is not enough food, they're in a barren place, everyone was satisfied. Mark is presenting to us a meal that would have cost you or I some $60,000 to $80,000 today came out of nowhere to feed this crowd. Then Jesus passes by in the wind of a storm, just as Yahweh did to Elijah and to Moses. And then the wind ceased as he climbs into the boat and he says, I am, do not be afraid. And you're supposed to say, this is all so familiar. We've gone back into Cracker Barrel and all the memories of the first Exodus come to mind. And you realize we've been here before. Because when you look at Jesus and you look at what he provides, you're reminded of Yahweh's provision. When you look at what Jesus says, you remember what Yahweh said. When you look at what Jesus does, you're reminded of what Yahweh did. And you're supposed to see Yahweh's words, Yahweh's actions, Yahweh's doings in Jesus, because Mark is making it undeniably clear, Jesus is God with you. That's the point here in Mark. What they were supposed to recognize is God is with them, among them. Which means the first tragedy that we make with this passage is when we teach it as some sort of prosperity gospel, right? You give Jesus your fish and your bread and watch how he multiplies it. That is the opposite point of the passage. The opposite point of the passage. That's not what it's about. It's not saying bring your few and he'll give you more. The amount of bread is not meant to say that it's a springboard for the miracle. The amount of bread is to say that while Israel's in rebellion, while Israel doesn't have enough to eat, God still came and satisfied them. That's the point. In spite of so little bread, in spite of so little fish, in spite of such hardened hearts, Yahweh comes to the earth to provide for his people. God is faithful. And it's evidenced here in Jesus. God has arrived and he's providing. Because teaching the passage the other way keeps money as the idol, doesn't it? It makes it about getting more money, and God just becomes some Vegas slot machine that hopefully you'll get more money. Because money's still what you love. It leaves you dead. But the point of the passage is that God has come. God really put on flesh. He really walked the earth. He really led these hardened disciples. And he really took a people out in the wilderness and made bread and fish arrive, enough to satisfy thousands of people. This is God, is what Mark is saying. None other. And so I can say to you now that until Jesus returns, I say to you, if you're an unbeliever today, it is not God's will to condemn you, but to save you. John 3:17. Christ died for sin. He came because he wants to save the world, not to condemn it. So I say to you today, before his return, his mercy and his grace is extended to all who would believe. So give up your sin. God really did come to the earth for us. Look to him. He's a much better king than Herod. You can trust him to provide. So turn from your sin. But not only are these miracles incredibly obvious, that is making the point that God is there in Jesus, the disciples' blindness is baffling, right? You imagine seeing that? I feel like I would say, what I would say to me now, and I think what maybe many of you would say is, if I saw that, I'd believe, I hope. If I saw that, I'd probably believe. But that's what's so baffling. Verse 36, what do they say to Jesus? Jesus, send them away. You imagine standing next to God and giving him those orders? Send them back to Herod's marketplace, Jesus. Verse 37, Jesus responds, you give them something. And their response of unbelief is, you want us to fork over a year's wages to try to make enough food for all these people? You guys seen The Sandlot? It's the movie about the Babe Ruth baseball, and the boys hit it over the fence, and they can't get it back. So they find all sorts of ways to try to get it back. They use a erector set catapult system. They reach out with some rod and a hook on it. They send one of the kids over on like a pulley system. They do thing after thing to try to get this ball back. Well, they finally meet the owner of the dog that is holding on to Babe Ruth's ball. And what does he say to them? He says, why didn't you just knock on the door? I'd have got it for you. You see, it's a pretty absurd thing to complain about the cost of bread to feed a crowd when you're standing next to the guy who made the entire universe. So that's the point. How absurd. You're complaining to the Lord that you don't have enough bread when you have the one who makes the molecules that hold bread together. Jesus, what do you want us to do? Well, nothing. He wants you to do the same thing he tells the woman at the well. If you ask for the water I give, you'd never be thirsty again. But they don't ask, do they? Instead, they say, send them back to the marketplace. But see, the apostles were correct that they themselves could not exact the cost of feeding this large crowd. And what Mark is showing us is that they did not base their calculations around having God with them. So by the time we get down to the water miracle, Mark shows the reason they were afraid in the boat is because of verse 52. They didn't understand the message of the loaves. The message of the loaves is that if you watch a guy feed 5,000 people, there's only one rational conclusion. He's God. And now he's with you. And because they didn't learn that miracle, when they're out at the boat at sea, they are completely terrified when Jesus says, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And what Mark wants you to do is he wants you to ask the disciples, he wants you to ask, what explains the disciples' behavior? And it's verse 52. After the great unveilings of Jesus' identity, after the feeding of the 5,000, after the walking across the sea, the glory passing by, what happened in the disciples' hearts? They were hardened. They were hardened. They were at war with Jesus. But you remember verse 51, they were amazed. They were wowed, but they remained at war in their hearts, and they did not believe. Verse 36, therefore, they preferred to party like Herod, to keep themselves safe, to keep themselves away from the responsibility of the crowd now gathered. They could not see that in Jesus, Isaiah's new exodus had begun. And therefore, they presumed the absence of God and his provision for this crowd. And I ask this morning, how often do we treat one another as if we were Herod rather than more like Jesus? When I think about the last year, I think in a lot of ways, I presume the absence of God as well. From the discipleship of my kids, to the shepherding and equipping of this congregation, to navigating the needs of our community, how we can reach them. What the Lord calls us to do, we don't have the strength for if all we do is look at ourselves. But Mark is reminding the new covenant community, you know where this story goes. Jesus doesn't abandon the disciples here. He goes to the cross for them. He went to the cross for us. He's gifted us now with a righteousness. How did you become righteous? It wasn't because of something you did. It was because in the wilderness of your unrighteousness, Jesus bestows it upon you. He has now, therefore, gathered us, as Peter says, bringing us to the shepherd and guardian of our souls. We walk in the green pastures of his shepherding even now. That is, church, you are the people of the new Exodus. You really are those who, just as Israel was walking away from Pharaoh, you have now walked away from sin and Satan. That doesn't mean you don't still battle. It doesn't mean that we don't go through hardships and that we aren't weak. But it does remember we now face life with God with us. Romans 5:1, therefore we have peace with God. 1 Peter 5, pray. Pray because the Lord cares about you. Which means, therefore, we no longer plan our lives as if God is absent from what he commands of us. I can tell you how many times I hear people say, Taylor, you can't expect people to do family worship because we're in a fallen world. Well, Ephesians 6:1-4 was given in a fallen world. But it was given to the new community, the new people of God who are going to obey now that the Spirit is in them. You should live and expect God to give you the strength to obey what he commands. 2 Peter 1, he's given us all things to live life in a way that is godly. So when we have no energy, left to lead our kids. Church, who are we? We're those who pray and give anyway. When we do not have the wisdom to navigate difficulty, do we just throw up our hands? No, we're to be those who ask the Lord, who gives wisdom generously. James 1. When our church has gatherings in the evening, we don't make excuses like we don't like to drive at night, even though we do drive at night to go to our friend's house and play cards. We gather with the people of God that we might invest in one another. When we think we don't have a nice enough home to invite others to, we look to the Lord and say, Lord, I don't have much, but I want to be hospitable as you were. And we are compassionate anyway. When we consider that without hearing the gospel, our coworkers will never believe, we don't resign to only serve in the background. We ask the Lord for courage. Give us the words to speak, because we no longer minister as those far off from God, but now those who are filled with His Spirit and His provision. When there are visitors at church, we don't wait for a program to draw them near. Instead, we go to them, and we love them, and we ask them out to lunch or into our home, not because we are extreme extroverts, but because we love Jesus, and He is present with us. We don't explain away our avoidance of people as introversion, even if it's true. In light of our introversion, Jesus gives us the energy to love others, but we must be focused on Him. So I ask, church, are you those who are wowed by God while you remain at war with Him? Let me remind you that this Christ who made this great provision in the wilderness, this Christ who walked across the water, He is now the God whom you are unified with. And therefore His commands are not burdensome. Your soul, which was once a barren and desolate place to the Lord, is now a wellspring of joyful obedience. We are no longer at war with God, church. We aren't a people starved in the wilderness. You are caught up in God's new creation purposes as you await for His return. So, Crossroads, I charge you, labor to treat the crowds as Jesus would. Labor not to be satisfied with the way Herod sends them away. So I ask, are you like the disciples, merely wowed by Jesus, or do you worship Him as God, expecting new Exodus fruit in obedience to His command? Because in Christ you are no longer barren. Let's pray.